In this video, I'm gonna give you some tips and advice on how to shoot expired film. So this is something of a follow-up video to a previous one I've done a couple years ago. If you want to see the extended version, I'll leave a link to it up here. This is just some straightforward advice. I'm going to be covering C41, black and white, and E6. I won't be covering how to develop since I send all my stuff to the lab, but I will be showing you some basic tips on how to edit your photos in Lightroom. I'll also be including some information I picked up in my years of fucking up, so you can avoid my same mistakes and don't have to record additional footage after you realize that you missed some information. Before we get onto this though, I want to make the suggestion that if you're going to be shooting expired film, you want to be using a camera that you know and have worked with before. The reason for that is you don't know if any issues that come up will be due to bad emulsion or just the camera itself. What is most important about expired film beyond its age is how it was stored. You could have film that theoretically won't expire for 10 years, but if you leave it in a car during a hot summer day, even for just one day, it's gonna look like shit. Likewise, if you're using film that's been cold stored, or better yet frozen, since it was purchased 2 decades ago, there's a very good chance you're gonna be getting very good results with that without any need to compensate for that time. If, however, your film was left in a drawer or a cabinet for that same amount of time, and you applied the one stop, 1 decade rule, you may get some usable results, albeit with some grain. Different speed films will handle aging differently, with slower speed films aging more gracefully. For example, Portrait 160 will probably age a lot better than Portrait 800. Although you can always expect expired film to have some extra grain and loss of contrast. Let's start off with C41 film. This is actually the most versatile and forgiving of all the expired films you'll come across. The general rule with color film or C41 is you want to overexpose one stop for every 10 decades. But normally, even with fresh film like Portrait 400, I will overexpose a stop and meter for the shadows. And that is to say, I would put something like a light meter like this Sekonic one and put it right about here for when I'm doing portraiture. As I said earlier, C41 is actually super forgiving when it comes to overexposure. So if you're not sure, it is safe to overexpose and even bracket if you want to. With one at the metering you think it is, one stop over, and then the other 2 stops over. That's something I would suggest if you just have one roll of the film and you don't really know when it was expired or how it was stored. For example, my friend Diana gifted me this expired roll. No idea on when it was expired and for how long or how it was stored. So since this is 400, I'll be rating it at 200, which is 1 stop over the suggested rate. Again, I'm gonna emphasize this a lot. C41 film is super forgiving when it comes to overexposure. With the exception of Ektar, I will regularly rate my C41 film 1 stop over regardless of how fresh it is. But the reason I bring that up is that if you're ever in doubt about where to expose your C41 film, I would lean on the side of overexposure. But since I know it's better to see than to hear it from me, here's an example taken on Portrait 400. I had my Nikon F100 set to multi-exposure and was trying to figure out why my film went in advance. That would be my advice if you just came across one roll of undated expired film. Worst case scenario, it's actually fresh and you just overexpose the stop, which, as I already showed, isn't a bad thing. Ideally, if you ever come across a batch or brick of expired film, either online or in your parents' attic somewhere, you can almost be certain that it's going to handle exposure the same. So what I would do in that situation is take one of those rolls and bracket my shots while also writing everything down. But instead of doing the whole one at, under, and over, how I would bracket would be taking 1 shot at, 1 stop over, and then 2 stops over. Then I would write down what I rated the film, how I metered, as well as my exposure settings. That way you'll be able to make any corrections if need be, and also know what to expect from your expired film. This will be your best option if you don't really know how a film was stored or when it was expired, instead of just going online and trying to look for examples. Variations do and can occur. This is something I want to point out and isn't necessarily a bad thing, since there have been photographers that have created entire series based off one film's unique look. Now, although I've said C41 is the most forgiving when it comes to being expired, I would say black and white ages the best. C41 has those dyes, and black and white, it's just the silver, I forget. I constantly see people apply the 1 decade, 1 stop rule to black and white when you don't really need to. The rule I've applied for black and white film when I'm actually shooting expired tends to be maybe a third of a stop for every decade. And that again completely depends on the storing conditions. For example, I was able to pick up this 100-foot roll T-Max 100 film. It expired 11/2013 and it was just stored in a room. I have had zero issues with this film. I forgot how many rolls I bulk loaded with this, but after the first two I got a feel for the film and still measure it at 100 ISO without doing like a quarter stop or messing around with that. People will try to get all technical with the age of a film, but again, if it's bulk loaded, you can write down your metering and the settings as well as the light that you were accounting for. If you're gonna meter for expired E6 film, I would still meter for the highlights. So again, if using my hand as an example, I would meter for the light right here and just see what you get there. My tips for E6 is generally don't shoot it. It has a very narrow exposure latitude. I have seen people online just mindlessly give that 1 decade for every stop rule without really paying any mind to the fact that E6 is, when fresh, notoriously difficult to meter for and unforgiving as hell. You throw in the fact that it's expired and you're just essentially asking for trouble. And I say that because I have shot expired E6 film that was poorly stored and correctly stored. With the correctly stored one, which was the Ektachrome 64T that I shot in the longer version of this video, I incorrectly metered for the shadows when you're supposed to generally be metering for the highlights with slide film, and you could tell that the highlights were just completely blown. So again, you can't really apply that 1 stop 1 decade rule to E6 since it really does demand you nail that exposure instead of just overexposing when in doubt. So if you're really not sure about how a film was stored, you're taking a real gamble since nothing is guaranteed, and you will definitely end up with some nearly transparent negatives if you have film that was poorly stored, like some Fujichrome I had the misfortune of buying. That said, I did get lucky with some decade-old Provia that I shot at box speed back when I first started shooting film and decided to cross-process that. Just something to consider if you ignore my don't do it advice and want to experiment with some looks. On something of a related note, since I never really got to talk about this before, there have been rumors that Variochrome is actually expired Provia film, which is something you can kind of see and is a note I want to make since Fuji seems to be discontinuing all their films. And yes, I am claiming that since it's almost been a year since they officially discontinued Acros and have done nothing to really address the community's concerns. So yeah. Last couple of tips I have for you regarding expired film is setting your ISO. If you're setting your ISO manually on your camera and would prefer to use your on-camera meter, you can set your ISO to overexpose for you. For example, setting your camera's ISO to 1600 when you have 3200 on board, then aiming for the darkest part of your scene to set your exposure. If you're using a camera that automatically detects your film's DX coding, that part right here, there are hacks to trick your camera into thinking it's shooting a lower speed film. I'll leave a card for that up here somewhere. Lastly, although I won't get into the development of expired film, I can give some advice on how to edit and possibly save some expired film shots that come back a bit flat. So as something as a reward for those of you who've stuck around this long in the video, I'm going to cover post-processing in Lightroom when you're shooting expired film and show you how I would edit some of the photos I've taken in the past, including those from the original expired film video. I originally did not want to edit those because 1, I wanted people to see what kind of results you can expect, and 2, I was something of a purist back then and believed that if you didn't get it in camera, you weren't being honest if you edited it after the fact. But kind of realizing that that wasn't something that was very common back in the film days. People actually edited their photos a lot in the darkroom, Ansel Adams being a prime and most used example of that. I decided if I can do it in the darkroom, I would probably do it in Lightroom as well. So using Lightroom as a starting point, I'm going to go ahead and cover a couple of these shots and how I would edit them now. So these edits I'm going to do aren't very dramatic, but they do cause quite a drastic change in the final result. So these first few shots are actually from that 100-foot roll of T-Max I showed earlier in the video. And as you can see, I kind of underexposed this. So first thing I want to talk about is this gap in the histogram you see here. Most often, the only edit I will do to some of these photos when I screw up is just bring it down. So it's a very minor change, but you can already see how drastic it is. Another thing I will do, and something I've started doing recently too, is just bring up those highlights. So the histogram is, yeah. So the histogram is a little more spread out. I use the histogram as more of a guide instead of a, rule, since a lot of photos I take either have primarily black or primarily white, and the histogram isn't gonna, it's gonna show that, but it's not gonna be as even as this. As you can see, there's quite a bit of a spike here, but there are a lot of black parts to this, and I don't think this is necessarily a bad exposure, but I would fix that. There's probably some of you that are probably breathing a sigh of relief right now because of that, but now there's this spot right here. But anyways, as you can see, I hardly did anything to this. It's already looking a lot better. As I said, expired film will lose a bit of contrast, so you could just change that to your liking. In the darkroom, you would probably just put on some orange filters, but that's one shot. This one is looking a lot worse, but same thing, just bringing down those blacks, and bam, we're already like, it's still a bad shot. I don't know what I was thinking when I took this, but it's looking better than it did before. It's not such a muddy mess. And just bring up those highlights. Oh, what are we doing? Okay, yeah, that looks all right. And let's just fix that horizon. Again, I know these aren't gonna be award-winning shots, but I'm using these as examples of what you could do to post-process some of these shots if you're just starting out with film and you get your scans back from the lab and want to add a bit more contrast and also fix that histogram. Alright, so these ones, this is the E6, this is the Ektachrome 64T. Something I refused to do at the time was color correct, which is something I should have done, considering that these were, I forget, the 64T, it's balanced for tungsten lighting, that's what I meant to say. So it's just always going to be blue unless it's shot under tungsten light. You can correct for this blue lighting here by shooting an orange filter. I forget the exact type, but if you forgot to shoot with a filter, or you just didn't know at the time like I did, you can just take this white balance tool right here and just meter off something gray, and that's already looking a lot better. But as you can tell by both the histogram and what I said earlier in the video, I did measure for the highlights on this, so it is pretty blown. So what I would do is probably bring down the exposure just a touch and bring those blacks down a lot. So that's looking a bit better, but I'm gonna go ahead and add some contrast as well. Maybe bring down the highlights a little. It's not gonna fix the image because it is overexposed, but I'm already liking it a lot better than that original shot. Let's see if I can, oh maybe, I think that looks a little better. Let's bring up the shadows a little. Yeah, I think that's all right. That's okay. It's not the best, but I can probably just copy these settings, since I shot these all under similar conditions more or less, except this last one. But let's just use that same white balance, see what happens here. Oh my, yeah. So once, you're not always gonna have the luxury of having something white or gray in your photo to meter off of, but if you find one like this photo and it works well on these other ones, I actually really like this one. So yeah, if you find one photo and it's the same film, like these all four were shot in 64T, I would just take the white balance from one and apply it across the board. And as you can see, it's getting me pretty close to the results. And like, I might actually post this pretty soon. This is actually, yeah, this is good. And yeah, that's a lot better. I'll probably add a little more contrast. So this is just kind of like a speed edit. Once you nail your settings for one, you can just apply that across the board. Fix that horizon. These were shot on Pentax 645, if you remember. And last one, this was the first one I talked about, is this C41 film. Let's check if this is still recording. Okay, still recording. So this is the C41. So this is C41 that I shot. And again, we're gonna see this giant gap both in the blacks as well as the highlights. And again, very small change. So these same changes, as you can see, apply across the board, whether you're shooting C41, E6, or black and white. And it just comes down to the exposure. Words I can't English right now. But yeah, we're gonna take that black slider and just bring it down and make it look gorgeous. Just looks so gorgeous right there. And bring that down, bring this up. And as I said, you can have your exposure be close to spot on, and it won't matter so much depending on the film you're shooting, because it's gonna end up coming out pretty grainy. One thing I have learned with film in general, but especially with expired film, is that if you're shooting in the shade, it's not really gonna come out all that well. So the same film came out really well when it was out in, you know, the broad daylight of the same building, but when I shot it in the stairwell, it came out like this. So film doesn't really do all that well in shady spots, I would say, at least stairwells when you're shooting expired. So just keep that in mind. Some of these just need just a touch. Just a touch. Oh, just a touch. Make up for that contrast. It's looking a bit green to me, but you don't really need to do this. Let's see, color balance. Yeah. So there's that. I don't really need to do too much to this. The histogram looks pretty good. I'm pretty content. I might just add a bit of contrast. Maybe bring down the blacks just a wee bit. And that's it. That's the winner right there. I might use it for the thumbnail on my video from 2 years ago, which I did. But yeah, that's one. This is a one stop under, I believe. You can check out that original video for the full details. Again, this is an example of what will happen to film, especially expired, when it's not shot in open daylight like this. So this is one scenario. You saw how that looked. This is another. You might like this look, you might not, but there is that bit of a gap in the shadows or blacks. So I'll bring down that slider and bam. Also fix that horizons. Annoy me. There we go. So yeah, that's the shot. Add a bit of contrast. Bring up the highlights a bit. That's gorgeous. I forget my settings for this, but same thing. Bring down the blacks. Bring up the highlights. Add a bit of contrast. And that's it. That's no, I forgot the horizons. Yeah. Hell yeah. Alright. So yeah, that is my little tutorial on so yeah, that's my little tutorial on how to edit your film shots. This was probably a lot longer than the aforementioned tips. Anyways, that's my follow-up video on how to shoot expired film. I'm almost certain I forgot to include some information since I did have to cut in additional footage. So if you have any additional questions beyond what should I rate this film I found in my great grandpa's back pocket after he was found dead between sea cushions after decades of being missing, please feel free to ask down below. If you have any similar questions, my answer is going to be overexposed and I hope you were wearing gloves. Other than that, if you liked the video, please consider doing the usual. Like, subscribe, comment, or just ignore me. I'm kind of used to it at this point. But until the next video, keep chasing that light. Right, I'm talking too fast. Rubber baby buggy bumpers, rubber baby buggy bumpers, unique New York, unique New York. Okay, that's going to the back. That's my follow-up video on how to shoot expired film. I'm almost certain I left some things out since I did have to record additional footage. So if you have any questions beyond what should I rate this film I found in my great grandpa's back pocket after he was found dead in sea cushions between